to give their take on outlook for the economy of 2022 and cover a lot of what's going on in Washington right now. And with that being said, I'm going to go off video and I'm going to let Bob Stein take over for a moment.
Thank you very much. Everybody should be able to see my presentation, hopefully by now. I'm sharing it up on the screen. Just by way of background, I've been with First Trust for 15 years as an economist. Before that, I spent 4 years at the U.S. Treasury Department, finishing up as Assistant Secretary for Macroeconomic Policy. And before that, I spent 7 years on Capitol Hill, the last 2 as the Chief Economist for the Senate Budget Committee. What I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is what's going on in Washington, D.C. and the state of the economy. I want to tell you, though, up front, when I talk about politics, I am not here to talk about what I, Bob Stein, would personally like to see happen over the next few years. I'm going to talk about what I think will happen instead, whether I like it or not. In terms of what's going on in Washington, D.C. right now, all eyes are on whether or not the Democrats can pass a Democratic-only spending and tax plan called Build Back Better that the Biden administration has proposed. Here's the deal. At the very beginning of this year, I thought there was about an 80% chance that this bill would pass in some form or another. Now, I think it's a little bit less than 50%. It wouldn't shock me if the Democrats were able to pull a rabbit out of the hat and get it enacted very late this year or early next year. But as of now, I'm a slightly less than 50%. Big change from where I was almost 12 months ago. I will talk in a moment about what any tax hikes would look like if a bill gets to the president's desk. But for now, I'd like to talk about some other policy issues percolating in Washington, D.C. One issue is the minimum wage. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party wants to see a $15 minimum wage. They want to see it now. However, in my opinion, they're not going to see $15, and they're certainly not going to see it now. My best guess is that sometime in the spring of next year, Republicans and Democrats will come together on a compromise bill to raise the minimum wage to something on the order of $11 or $12 an hour, but phased in gradually over a couple of years, not 15, and not in one fell swoop. In terms of trade conflicts, we saw a lot of trade conflict between the Trump administration and foreign governments around the world over the previous 4 years. Under the Biden administration, it's going to be a little different. I think they're going to be much more accommodating for foreign governments. The one major exception will be China. We saw 24 years of trade accommodation with China, bipartisan, under President Clinton, President Bush, and President Obama. That changed under President Trump, and that will remain a more hostile relationship than it was before President Trump took office, even under Joe Biden and whomever gets elected afterwards. In terms of big tech, my theme for the Biden administration is very simple. Lots of barking, very little biting. Now, that doesn't mean zero biting, but I think the bites will really be nibbles more than anything else. I do expect a slowdown in merger and acquisition activity in big tech. I think antitrust enforcement will be a little bit tougher, but I also expect a slowdown in merger and acquisition activity across the entire United States economy, not just big tech. In addition, I expect bipartisan legislation to regulate social media enacted next year. Here's the dirty little secret in Washington, D.C., though. The big players in social media actually want more regulation. I know that sounds odd, but here's the reason. The more regulation they have, the easier it is for them to defend their market share against upstart companies and other companies as well that are not yet in social media. So it's real more social media regulation is really incumbent protection more than anything else. The reason I don't think the Biden administration will in any significant way bite the hand of big tech is because if you look at the political donations coming from big tech, be they Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Apple, they are overwhelmingly in the direction of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is not run by fools or idiots, so they're not in any significant way going to bite the hand that feeds them. In terms of environmental rules, or what I call green regulations, I want you to think in terms of 3 different buckets for environmental rules over the next few years. Bucket number one, this is where the Biden administration is going to make some changes, and there is nothing the Republicans can do to stop him. An example of this is raising the automobile mileage fleet standards for US cars and trucks. It's going to happen. The CAFE standards will be raised. Nothing the Republicans can do to change that. Bucket number two, these are areas where the Biden administration is making changes, but it's really not having a big effect on the energy market just yet. This an example of this is slowing down the process for new leases for drilling and extracting fossil fuels on federal land. It is true the Biden administration has already made that change. It is true that energy prices are up significantly this year. So the Republicans are pointing to the change in policy and the rise in energy prices. They're saying, hey, it's obvious. Let's put two and two together. We get four. However, I believe the price rise in energy would have happened anyhow. The Trump administration was giving away these leases like they were going out of style in 2019 and 2020. So yes, the slowdown has occurred for new leases, but it's really going to take a few years to bite the energy market. Bucket number three is a little more complicated. I believe that the Biden administration is going to issue a lot of new rules over the next few years that make it harder for utilities to burn fossil fuels to generate electricity, and make it harder for drillers and extractors to get fossil fuels out of the ground across the entire United States, not just on federal land. However, I believe there is now a Supreme Court majority to overturn something called the Chevron decision from the mid-1980s. The Chevron decision, which dates back to 1984, Chevron, like the oil company, basically said that if federal regulators issue new rules, that the courts are going to have a light touch. They're not going to strictly scrutinize those new rules. They're basically going to assume the regulators knew what they were doing. If they overturn the Chevron decision, the court will have an opportunity to impose a much stricter level of scrutiny on new federal regulations. For example, they could say that if regulators come out with new rules, if those regulators are then challenged in court, that the regulators have to show specifically where Congress passed a law giving those particular regulators the authority to issue that particular set of rules. It's a much stricter level or higher level of scrutiny. And I think many of the environmental rules coming from the Biden administration over the next couple of years are going to fail that test. In terms of tax changes, I want to remind you, I think there is at best, so a 50% or minus chance, 50% or less chance that any tax changes are enacted anytime soon. In other words, all the tax changes I've been talking about all year, that at the beginning of this year I thought were going to happen, I think there's less than a 50% chance this happens. There's less than a 50% chance a tax bill, Build Back Better, gets to Joe Biden's desk. But let's talk about what's going to happen just in case Biden gets to sign a change in tax laws. First thing I want you to know is I don't think any part of the tax hike would be retroactive to January 1st or any other part of 2021. I think they'd be effective January 1st of 2022 instead. Right now, we have a top tax rate of 37%. Some members of the House, in fact, the House passed a bill that would raise the top rate on the very highest earners to 45%, but I don't think that's going to happen. And here's why. If you're in New York City or California, your top rate would be 45 federal, essentially 13 state and city for New York City, and then another 3.8 percentage points Medicare, essentially a 62% marginal tax rate. In the end, I don't think Chuck Schumer is going to allow his strongest donors in New York City to be hit with that high a marginal tax rate. So he'd vote for it if it gets to the floor, but as majority leader, he's going to work overtime to make sure it never gets to the floor in the first place. If the Democrats raise the top tax rate, I think the highest they would go would be 39.6%. Now, 39.6% should ring a bell. That's exactly where it was for 8 years under Bill Clinton, the last 4 years under President Obama, and the first year under President Trump. And 39.6% had two things in common. That 13-year era had a bull market in stocks and not one recession during any of those 13 years. However, I don't think 39.6% is magic. You can't just move to 39.6% and prevent bear markets and recessions. So I'm not saying you can't have a bear market or recession at 39.6. I'm just saying that 39.6 by itself will not cause one. In terms of the corporate rate, we had 35% for a generation before President Trump took office. He took it to 21%. The highest we'll go is 25%. We may stay at 21%, even if Joe Biden gets to sign a tax hike. So to me, that's a glass half full. If I could have imagined 3 years ago that the Democrats would control the House, the Senate, and the White House today, I would have assumed we'd go higher than 25%. The fact that there were somewhere between 21 and 25% for the corporate rate, I think that's a glass half full and not empty. In terms of the SALT cap, right now we have a limitation of $10,000. I think if a bill gets to the president's desk, they raise it to something like 20 or 25,000 instead. In the alternative, they might raise it higher, but then they claw back some of that benefit by limiting the value of the deduction to maybe 15% of taxes of the state and local taxes paid. So they'd reduce the value of the deduction for upper income taxpayers relative to lower income taxpayers. In terms of capital gains and dividends, the Biden administration originally proposed 39.6%. That's not going to happen though, okay? Right now, the statutory tax rate, the highest one on capital gains and dividends for the highest earners is 20, plus we have a 3.8% Medicare tax. So essentially we have a tax rate all in of 24% on the top earners in the United States on capital gains and dividends. What I think the Democrats might do is raise that 20 to 24, which means the all-in rate becomes 28%. Now 28% should ring a bell from the distant past. 32 years ago, that's exactly where the rate, or 33 years ago, that's exactly where the rate was in January 1989 when Ronald Reagan left office. So it would put the Democrats in a position where they could say, if it was good enough for Reagan, it should be good enough for us today. In terms of other changes, the Biden administration wanted to get rid of the step-up basis of death. That's not going to happen. They're going to keep the step-up basis of death. And that means if you inherit stock or other assets, when you go to sell it, you'll only pay taxes on the gain that occurred after you inherited that asset. What I think they do instead of getting rid of the step-up basis of death, which by the way has been the law of the land in the United States for the past 100 years, is reduce the estate tax exemption. Right now, this year, it's 11.7 million, I think. It's going up a little above 12 million next year on schedule. I think they end up reducing it to 6 or 7 million instead. That would be a little bit higher than the 5.5 million that prevailed before President Trump took office, but clearly lower than today. But that gives policymakers a way of raising revenue from people who inherit assets without causing the administrative nightmare that would ensue if they get rid of the step-up basis of death. Many people have no idea what their parents or grandparents originally paid for an asset. In terms of politics future, the way I see it today, and this may change over the course of the year, is that the issue isn't really whether there's going to be a wave in the Republicans' direction or not next year. It's going to be whether there's a wave or whether there's going to be a tsunami. I think the Republicans have a 95% chance of taking over the House next year. Democrats already have razor-thin majorities in the House. So the Republicans gain about 5 seats. They'll take over the House, historically speaking. That would be small for an out party, a party that does not control the White House. Usually the midterm history is that the party that does not control the White House does quite well. When I look at state legislative races around the country in 2020, I noticed Republicans did well. That was same year they lost the presidency. They did well in state legislative races, which means they hold the pen on drawing where those district lines go around the country. In addition, if I look at the Virginia races, gubernatorial and state legislative races, same thing for New Jersey, a judicial race in Pennsylvania this past November. I'm looking at a lot of momentum in the Republican direction. So I think they're 95% chance again to take the U.S. House. I also make them favor to take the Senate, but only 75%, not 95%. So what's the deal here? Why is it 75 rather than 95? Really 2 reasons, okay? The Democrats only have to defend 14 Senate seats this time around. Look at the math. There are 435 House seats. A majority are Democrats and a majority And all of those seats are up for grabs next year. So that gives the Republicans a lot of seats to shoot at to try to gain the majority back. In the U.S. Senate, there are 100 seats, but those are 6-year terms. There are only 34 Senate races. Among those 34, Republicans already occupy 20 of those seats. Democrats only occupy 14. So that simply gives the Republicans fewer seats to shoot at to try to get the majority in the U.S. Senate. In addition, there's something that I call the Christine O'Donnell problem for the Republicans. Back in 2010, President Obama was in office. Joe Biden was his vice president. Joe Biden had been a longtime senator from the state of Delaware. So he left that seat in Delaware, and that means the Republicans had a chance to replace him. And they had a great candidate. They had a guy named Mike Castle, a former governor, a member of the House of Representatives from the state of Delaware for many years. The people of Delaware were very familiar with him. It's not like California. In Delaware, you only have one member of the House of Representatives. So when you get elected as a House member from Delaware, you're being elected statewide, just like a senator, just like an attorney general, just like a governor. You have name recognition through the roof, and he has evidence of popularity, given the fact that he's been reelected time and time again. And so the Republicans, in their infinite wisdom, decided to squander that seat by not nominating Mike Castle and instead nominating Christine O'Donnell, who nobody has ever heard of since. She went on to lose that seat by 17 percentage points. So frankly, I think the Republicans' prospects look so good for next year in the elections that they may end up nominating some weaker candidates and frankly, some kooks, and end up losing seats they otherwise could win. In terms of the presidential race, obviously we're a long way off here, but let me give you a 30,000-foot view. Yes? Oh, sorry. Thought somebody was calling my name. So here's the deal. If Joe Biden wants to run for office again, he'll be the nominee for the Democrats. I think in the end, he probably will not run for office. And I think it's wide open. Normally, the vice president has pole position. But if you look at her ratings and the assessment of other Democrats, Kamala Harris is in political danger. And I think there are numerous people who might run against her. The one I get the biggest chuckle about, by the way, when I say Cuban, I mean Mark Cuban, the billionaire entrepreneur. But what I get the biggest chuckle about is Howard Stern. I mean, just as an American, I think we could all agree that a Howard Stern, Donald Trump presidential debate would be at least mildly entertaining. Quite vulgar, but mildly entertaining. In terms of Republicans, he's not going to get their nomination, chances are, but still, I have him on the list. He will seriously consider running. On the Republican side, there's President Trump. If he decides to run, he'll probably, not definitely, but probably be the Republicans' nominee. I'm 50-50 right now. I really, he's the one politician I could never get in his head. It's so hard to figure out what he's thinking. If he decides not to run, then I think Ron DeSantis has the inside path. But watch out for Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, former congressman from the state of Kansas. He's whip smart, graduated top of his class at West Point many years ago. He's lost 100 pounds. He's quick on his feet mentally. He'd be dangerous in debates. If I were to give the award at this point for the most underrated candidate on the Republican side, it'd be Mike Pompeo. Okay, so I think DeSantis would probably get the better of him, but Pompeo is definitely someone who could be dangerous. This is all depending on Trump not running. If either of these two fellows got the nomination, I think they'd pick Nikki Haley as the running mate. In terms of the U.S. economy, my theme for this year and next year, glass half full, glass half empty. For this year, we're going to end up with economic growth around 5.5%, maybe even 6%. Best year for U.S. economic growth for any year since the early 1980s. Glass half full. The glass half empty part is even with 5.5% plus economic growth, the U.S. economy at the end of this year is still smaller than it would have been in the absence of COVID. We're likely to get 6.5 to 7 million jobs this year when all is said and done. We're still waiting on data for December, obviously, just the last month of the year. Even with that, great year for job growth, we're still below par. We're still below where we were in February 2020 pre-COVID. I think the growth will continue at a slower rate, both GDP and jobs next year. Eventually, we should get back to par. In terms of inflation, I'm looking at 6.5 to 7% for this year when all is said and done. next year, I think the Fed is right. Inflation will be lower next year. What they're wrong about is how much lower. They think it's going to be a lot lower. I only think it's going to be a little lower. I'm looking at 4% inflation with more risk to the upside than the downside for next year. Here's where I'm out of consensus. Okay, on long-term interest rate, I think we're going up to around 2%. So that's on par with the consensus, but I'm out of consensus on short-term rates. I think we'll only get one rate hike next year, and it will come late in the year. Now, the Fed is going to issue a dot plot tomorrow afternoon, actually tomorrow morning if you're on the West Coast. And that dot plot is going to suggest they're going to raise 2, maybe even 3 times next year. My theme for next year is simple. And I could be wrong about this. I'm not an oracle. My theme for next year is simple. Policymakers are willing to raise rates, but the flesh is weak. Personnel determine policy. And what I see at the Federal Reserve, what I see going on in terms of the personnel changes that are being made, are moving the Fed in a more dovish direction. We had 2 Federal Reserve Bank presidents who recently resigned due to trading scandals. Bob Kaplan from Dallas, Eric Rosengren from Boston. They were on the hawkish side. I think they'll probably be replaced with maybe 1 hawk and 1 dove. We had Richard Clarida, the gentleman who hired me to the Treasury Department about 20 years ago, who is vice chairman of the Fed. He's leaving at the end of January. We have Randy Quarles, with whom I worked at the Treasury Department. He's the head of, or was the head of regulatory supervision. He's leaving at the end of this calendar year. Both of those gentlemen are on the hawkish side, and there's 1 pre-existing vacancy at the Fed. I add that up, and I think the Fed may have a more dovish tilt next year than people anticipate. So I could be wrong about this, but I think they're, in the end, they're going to chicken out and only raise rates once late next year. In terms of questions, I'd love to stick around. I think I've left plenty of time for those. And if they want to be organized, I'd be happy to delve into those shortly.